This might blow a lot of people's minds, but it's been a whole 10 years since Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor first launched way back in October of 2014, a game that went on to be one of the most successful games of the year, not only selling upwards of 8 million copies, but also winning multiple awards, rounding out an average score of around 84 on Metacritic, and overall just became a bit of a cult classic within the gaming community. Despite all the positives, it did come with its fair share of controversy as well, causing a bit of a stir within the die-hard Lord of the Rings fandom due to some canonical inaccuracies which essentially render it non-canon, as well as even being accused of stealing assets from Ubisoft, which we'll dive into a little bit later in the video. But it's fair to say it wasn't all smooth sailing for this game, despite overall being seen as an overwhelming success for Warner Brothers Entertainment. Now, as a big Lord of the Rings fan myself, I have played this game multiple times over the last decade, but I'm here to admit a sin. Despite trying multiple times, I actually never got around to finishing this game, even though I really wanted to finish it. I'd either get distracted by another game or just life in general. I'd lose interest 3 hours in, and it just seemed like it was going to be one of those games that I never got around to finishing, despite it being pretty much my perfect storm of a video game in a franchise that I've loved since I was a kid. Well, this year, knowing that its 10-year anniversary was closing in, I decided to change that, and I can now finally say that I've finished the game after all these years, so that I can take you guys on a retrospective journey through Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor. Today, we're going to dive deep into the world, the Nemesis system, the gameplay, and the story to see whether this game was overrated and received a little bit too much hype, or whether 10 years on, it really was as special as we all remember it to be. Now, something this game doesn't really explain all that well when it comes to the setting and the overall lore is whereabouts in the timeline of Middle-earth that it actually takes place. It is established that the game is set during the roughly 60-year period between the events of The Hobbit and the Fellowship of the Ring, but even then it is still pretty vague about the year that the game's set in, and there's pretty conflicting info out there, meaning realistically we don't know the exact answer, other than taking an educated guess that it's probably a couple of decades after the events of The Hobbit. This is where some of the drama surrounding this game already came into play, because there are more than a few inconsistencies in this game when it comes to the already very well established lore, and like I said earlier, it is considered to be non-canon because of some of those inconsistencies, albeit there are far more and far bigger inconsistencies in the sequel, Shadow of War, that we won't get into in today's video. And so, even though most people, myself included, don't really mind the non-canon aspect, I do recall it rubbing more than a few hardcore Tolkien fans up the wrong way at launch. Despite that, the setting that we're thrown into at the beginning of this game does feel very much like it's set in the Middle-earth universe. Outside of some of those lore inconsistencies, it does feel very authentic to Lord of the Rings. There's a familiar sort of doom and gloom to the world, and even the characterization of the orcs, or Uruks as they're mostly referred to in this game, is very aligned with the orcs that we see in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Although we will dive deeper into the actual story and the plot later on, one character that I really need to talk about right away is Talion, the protagonist of this game, who's a ranger of Gondor tasked with guarding the Black Gate of Mordor, played by the very talented Troy Baker, who I'm sure many of you guys will most famously know from his role as Joel Miller in The Last of Us, and as always, he does not disappoint in his role as Talion. Right off the bat, you can tell that Talion is a very Aragorn-esque type of character, the stoic, brave warrior archetype, but the twist here is that he's also linked with a Wraith character, someone that we'll also talk a bit more in depth about later on, as these two are essentially fused together as one single being throughout the game, adding an awesome layer to not only the story but also the gameplay as we switch between the real world and the Wraith world throughout the game. Now, obviously the game is set in the lands of Mordor in a northwest section known as Uldun, and although the base map is pretty awesome in terms of its design and detail, I will say it can be very boring to look at times due to the bland, dark brown sort of color palette that we're stuck with for the majority of the game, at least the first half of the game anyway. Now, this is no fault of the developers, that is literally the only way that we've ever seen Mordor depicted, at least prior to the Rings of Power, where we do see it as a lush green landscape before some of the events that unfold throughout that show. And so it's not really a complaint from me, but it is still something that's hard to look past. The world you are traversing throughout this game is simply put, very, very depressing. With that being said, the layout, the detail, the different regions, and a good mix of wide open fields as well as dense populated fortresses full of enemies, it does have a good mix of everything that you'd want in a standard open world game, though ironically, it does feel very similar to what we'd refer to these days as a very Ubisofty open world map, which is generally seen as a negative thing. But being 10 years old now, I think this game kind of gets a bit of leniency there in the fact that this is just how games were back in the day, compared to some of the more robust, expansive open worlds we've been spoiled with over the years in the likes of Red Dead Redemption 2 or Elden Ring. At around the halfway point of the story, however, we are transported to a whole new location in the game known as Nirn, a much more luscious location that is just far less depressing to look at, albeit a tiny bit smaller than Udun and probably a tad less intricate as well, as there's really only a few big locations of note compared to the previous map. That said, it is a very nice change of pace and something that I really think does add a lot to the game, even if that is purely from the fact that it's not just a depressing brown landscape, as I'll be honest, that does start to wear down on a lot of people after about 10 to 15 hours of game time. And so I really do think that this was a great addition to the game that almost refreshed my interest once we arrived there at roughly the halfway point of the story. This is also where the story starts to pick up quite a bit too, meaning that some of the more memorable and intriguing moments of this game take place here rather than the first location. So it does add more than just a pretty landscape to look at, while on the flip side, Udun does definitely feel a bit more authentic to the setting and the overall story this game is trying to tell. Outside of some of those inconsistencies in the lore, namely to do with Talion and his Wraith counterpart, I think this game does a pretty great job of feeling like it's set in the Lord of the Rings universe. While I'm no Tolkien diehard that knows all of the ins and outs when it comes to his work, I still feel like the more casual Lord of the Rings fans that are just fans of the movies and maybe even the books will feel right at home as soon as they step into this awesome world that Monolith Studios created. Now, probably the single defining element of Shadow of Mordor is what's known as its now infamous Nemesis system, a complex, innovative mechanic that still to this day, 10 years later, is talked about as one of the single best features in any single player game to date, something that essentially hasn't been used since outside of the sequel to this game, Shadow of War. You see, Warner Brothers and Monolith Studios actually patented the technology behind this system at some point in 2021 after filing for that patent way back in 2015, meaning that by law, no other studio is allowed to replicate this system until that patent expires in around 2035, which is absolutely insane, and it's been talked about so regularly in the gaming industry as one of the more greedy decisions that we've probably ever seen in recent years. Instead of creating an amazing mechanic that could then breathe life to countless alternatives, iterations, and potential improvements on the original, Warner Brothers decided to keep it all to themselves so that no one could steal their idea. And while sure, they are actually well within their rights to do that, and I can also somewhat see the idea behind it wanting to keep that to themselves, it really does pain me to think of all the awesome games we could add this mechanic into over the last 5 or 10 years that would have made those games even better than they already were. While the gameplay, the setting, and the story of Shadow of War were all still very solid, the Nemesis system to me is what made this game the game that it is, a game that so many of us look back on as a genuine classic. It really did take this game from what was a fairly stock standard open world action adventure game to that next level in which it won countless awards and became financially the biggest success of any Lord of the Rings game ever made. Right from the very beginning of the game, we're introduced to the Nemesis system, and realistically, after a pretty quick explanation, we are almost immediately tasked with getting a rat bag, an out of favor orc, into a position of power within the Uruk hierarchy by killing one of the captains known as Goroth. As does every enemy in this system, Goroth has multiple strengths and weaknesses which determine what the best approach might be for any given target, and in the case of Goroth, he masquerades as a tough Caragor tamer, while in actual fact he has a very deep fear of Caragors. Evidently, the best approach to make the most of this is to release a Caragor from its cage, at which point Goroth becomes scared and therefore weakened, making him a much easier target to kill. But the best part about the Nemesis system is that even though that is the best approach if it's possible to do so, you don't have to do that. You can just take Goroth on head to head and back yourself to win that fight, and it just adds another layer of depth to what would be a very straightforward boss encounter in most other games. Now, this mission somewhat holds our hand through the introduction to the system, explaining how the system works and giving us kind of a free hit when it comes to that first interaction, because it does very heavily hint at the whole Caragor thing. But after this, it really opens up to our own interpretation, and all of a sudden the Nemesis system quickly becomes a pivotal part of not only the game but even the overall story, in which we essentially have full control over how we interact with each of these different members of the Uruk hierarchy. While the initial enemies in this system are all made by the developers, as some of them do play a pretty key part in the story, as you progress through the game and take out Uruk after Uruk, the game procedurally generates completely new and unique enemies to take up the positions of power from those you've just killed, meaning these aren't just generic villains for us to fight, rather a lot of them are completely unique and become somewhat tailored around us as the player. Each enemy within this hierarchy has their own unique traits, those namely being their strengths and weaknesses that change up the way you need to engage in combat with them, but some of them do even have somewhat of a personality, with some being more fearsome and menacing, while others are more on the goofy comedic side of things, and it really does make them all feel unique and personal, giving you reasons to like or dislike them and allows you to approach the system accordingly. Throughout my playthrough, I found some of these enemies to be incredibly difficult, even some of the lower bosses, let alone the war chiefs, while other enemies were incredibly easy, and that all came down to their unique traits that usually shape the way you need to engage in these confrontations. Some enemies will be completely vulnerable to stealth attacks, meaning that if you can sneak up on them, you can literally one-hit kill them despite them being a mini-boss, but the only way to actually find this out is by gaining intel on each of these enemies before you attack them. If you go in blind, you have no way of knowing how hard or easy they'll be, what the best way is to approach them, or if you can even kill them yet based on the abilities and skills you've unlocked at that point in the story. In order to gain this intel, you need to find specific enemies within the same region as those bosses, usually highlighted in green when you went to the Wraith world, but instead of killing these enemies, you need to grab them and essentially dominate their mind using your Wraith abilities that you get throughout the game in order to learn what you want to learn about different enemies within the system. Now, just like the Nemesis system overall, you don't need to do this. You can literally just attack anyone you want at pretty much any given time without any intel or without focusing on their weakness, but it does make the game a hell of a lot harder that way, and honestly, early on I was actually dying quite a bit simply because I thought I could sort of rush the process and just fight these guys head on without any prep time. As it turns out, not only is that not the play, as you will most likely struggle like I did, but to me it actually became one of the more enjoyable parts of the game, slowly picking my targets, gaining intel via the weaker enemies, finding the best approach and planning out my attacks. It just made the whole thing feel a lot more methodical and strategic, which realistically is exactly what the system is trying to do. This becomes even more crucial towards the middle of the game, as a large section of the story right before you move on to Nirn, the second map, is that you need to take out all 5 of the war chiefs, pretty much the head bosses outside of the actual main story bosses in the game, in order to essentially cripple Sauron's army and progress through the story, and this for me was easily the most difficult section of this game. If you try and take out a war chief without preparing, they usually have 1 or 2 bodyguards with them, who are essentially just the captains that are below them in that hierarchy. Because of that, you then need to go down the ranks and gain intel from their underlings in order to then take out each of those captains or bodyguards, which in itself is not an easy task, as these are also considered mini bosses. And then once you take those guys out, you still have to try and beat the war chief, who is usually very difficult and is often surrounded by a good 30 to 40 enemies within the safety of one of their fortresses. Then, once you take out that war chief, well, you've got to do it another 3 times, luckily the 4th time being part of a previous story where we actually get Ratbag, the orc that I mentioned earlier, into a war chief position, meaning that the 5th war chief is already sort of done. This section of the game really showed off the Nemesis system in all its glory, with so many different enemies having so many different strengths and weaknesses, and with all of them being difficult. Keep in mind that each time you die, the enemy that killed you will evolve, develop new attributes, and require you to change your plan of attack, and in the worst case scenario, some of them potentially get promoted to where they might fill the role of a captain that you just killed, meaning you have yet another captain to take out before you can get to that war chief. Something else that happens when you die, because Talion doesn't actually die, he just gets revived through his links to the Wraith, is that these enemies actually remember you. They remember what happened when you fought them last, if they killed you or if they maybe managed to flee to safety, and their voice lines will show that as they'll banter you about getting the best of you in your last altercation. It adds another layer of personalization to this game in that you feel like you have somewhat of a relationship or a rivalry with a lot of these enemies. There were multiple enemies that I faced that I could not for the life of me manage to kill due to their certain strengths, or maybe just being guarded by like 50 enemies in a fortress. They'd then proceed to kill me 2 to 3, even 4 times, and I'd begin to remember their names even if they were completely inconsequential to the story, and I didn't even see them more than once every couple of hours. But I felt like I had an actual rivalry with this made up orc in a video game, to where when I came across them later, I'd drop whatever I was doing just to go and finally get my revenge. When a game makes me care about characters like that, friendly or not, I see that as a really good thing, because it is pretty hard to achieve that more often than not. Later in the game, you can even dominate captains and war chiefs to where they essentially work for you instead of Sauron, which in itself is an awesome mechanic, but there's even more layers to this in that they can also betray you depending on different conditions, leading to some dramatic moments where someone you've just turned into a powerful ally quickly becomes a fearsome enemy, and all of this is completely dynamic. Other than the initial introduction with Ratbag, not one part of the Nemesis system is on rails. It is completely dynamic, completely unique to how you approach it, and as I mentioned before, really is what sets this game apart from being just another run-of-the-mill open-world action-adventure game. If there's one part of this game that does feel like it's aged a tiny bit since its launch way back in 2014, I'd probably have to say that that is the combat and really just the overall gameplay in the broadest sense of the term. While the gameplay is far from bad or anything like that, it does very much feel like a 10-year-old game in this area, while the rest of the game, the setting and the story, and especially that Nemesis system, they all feel pretty much on par with what you'd expect to see in the last 3 or 4 years since 2020. I mentioned earlier about some of the drama surrounding potential stolen assets from Ubisoft, and while it's never really been truly verified as to whether or not that was actually legitimate, it is very obvious that, stolen or not, the game takes a hell of a lot of inspiration from the Assassin's Creed franchise, namely the feeling of the Ezio trilogy in Assassin's Creed 2, Brotherhood and Revelations. If I had to sum up Shadow of Mordor's gameplay in less than 10 words, I would literally say Assassin's Creed 2, but it's Lord of the Rings, leaving me a whole word to spare, because that is essentially what this game is, if we're being honest here. While that could sound like a massive dig at Shadow of Mordor, it's actually not. Assassin's Creed 2 and Brotherhood are both probably in my top 10 favorite games of all time. So if you give me essentially a carbon copy of both of those games, but with a Lord of the Rings paint job, you best believe I'm going to be pretty damn happy about it. Regardless, it is very clear that the team at Monolith Studios directly looked at Assassin's Creed, which at the time was at the peak of its powers, and they straight up said, yep, let's do something pretty similar to that with our own spin on it. And I think this is potentially where some of those allegations came from in regards to potential stolen assets. Throughout the 2 maps in Shadow of Mordor, there are the typical Assassin's Creed towers that you need to climb and then synchronize with in order to lift the fog of war from the map and reveal everything you need to see throughout your journey. Now, that in itself is hardly a straight copy of Assassin's Creed. Many games have done stuff like that before, but when you combine it with the fairly random addition of climbing and parkour that we also see in Assassin's Creed, something that, let's be honest, doesn't really make a whole lot of sense for a pretty buff captain of Gondor to be doing in the Lord of the Rings universe, and then combine that with the very clear carbon copy of the iconic leap of faith from Assassin's Creed, once you do synchronize with each tower, we start to get an eerily similar feeling between the 2 games. Again, not a complaint from me, but I'd be lying if I said it wasn't blatantly obvious. To take that one step further from what is already a very similar style between the 2 games, the combat in this game, at least the base combat at the beginning before you start upgrading your skills, is also a straight up carbon copy of Assassin's Creed, being pretty much identical even down to most of the controls, with the typical attack and counter-attack system that Assassin's Creed did so well, as well as other games out there at the time like the Arkham games being fairly similar too. All of those those things combined, the combat, the traversal, the tower mechanics, and even the almost identical leap of faith animation, it does definitely start to feel like Assassin's Creed Mordor, something that the game was fairly criticized for back when it launched, but again, I also think a hell of a lot of people don't actually care. The Assassin's Creed formula was awesome back then, so another game being fairly similar to it is hardly an issue for a lot of people. Now that being said, once the game opens up and you start spending skill points and acquiring upgrades, this is where the game really does set itself apart from Assassin's Creed and realistically takes that combat to a whole other level that Assassin's Creed never even got close to reaching back in the day. Hell, even to this day with the newer ones, Shadow of Mordor can definitely hold its own against the combat of those games too. The majority of this improvement came from Talion's connection with the Wraith, allowing him to access otherworldly abilities that really did take the gameplay to that next level, from something as simple as the Wraith bow that allowed you to deal damage at range, to the ability to stun enemies with the Wraith cut on Talion's hand, which almost leaked the Wraith world out of it, allowing you to then chain a flurry of quick attacks to those enemies, to one of the best and most enjoyable abilities in the game, the Shadow Strike, which allows you to aim your bow at an enemy, then essentially teleport to that enemy, dealing a critical blow, not only looking awesome, but allowing you to really pull off some amazing traversal and very speedy stealth gameplay. Even just the basic finishes in this game were a whole lot of fun, having some pretty solid upgrades along the way too, allowing you to light your sword ablaze and pretty much behead enemies at will, which I vividly remember at one point resulted in a hilarious moment of this poor Uruk's head tumbling down a hill after I was kind enough to remove it from his neck. While I think the combat does have some deficiencies, one for me being the lack of a much needed lock-on system to keep your camera aimed where you want while you're fighting off dozens of orcs, it does really evolve and improve throughout the game, something that is a pretty key area for me in almost any game. Hell, if you guys watched my previous video on Star Wars Outlaws, that's one area I really crucified that game for, was the lack of gameplay evolution throughout the entire game, but I cannot say the same for Shadow of Mordor, as it really did feel like Talion became more powerful and more exciting to play as the game went on. While it hasn't aged perfectly in terms of the combat and just the overall traversal too, this game does still have some very solid gameplay that felt enjoyable almost the entire way through the game, and for a decade-old title, that is honestly pretty damn impressive. Now, the story of this game is probably one area in which it can kind of go either way depending on the player. To some players, this might be one of the more exciting stories of its generation, while to those more hardcore Tolkien fans who are looking for a canon addition to the universe, I can also see why this story would be really disappointing. And hell, there's even room in the middle there where a lot of people might just see this as a pretty standard, fairly mid storyline that's neither good nor bad, rather it just gives us something in the background of what a lot of people saw as the focal point, that being the Nemesis system. The story starts off very explosive and definitely had me hooked right away every single time I've tried to play it. Right off the bat, we're introduced to Talion, his wife Irith, and his son Deerhail, all three of who are voiced by some phenomenal voice artists. I already mentioned Troy Baker as Talion, but Laura Bailey, potentially the most renowned female voice actor in the world, known for her roles in The Last of Us, Spider-Man, Marvel's Avengers, I could genuinely go on for hours. She plays the fairly small role of Irith in this game too. One that blew me away was that Jack Quaid, who plays Huey in the Amazon hit The Boys, he actually plays the role of Talion's son Deerhail. And when you look at the rest of the cast, the likes of Nolan North, Matthew Mercer, Yuri Lowenthal, Claudia Black, Steve Bloom, Jennifer Hale, John DiMaggio, JB Blank, Alistair Duncan, the list genuinely goes on, and it results in what might be the most stacked pool of voice actors that I've ever seen come together for a single video game, which definitely pays off throughout the story. Now, right from the get-go, we are thrust into a chaotic story with Talion, Irith, and Deerhail all getting slaughtered within roughly the first 10 minutes of the game by the Black Hand of Sauron in what is one of the more chaotic intros to a game that I can remember in years. We very quickly learn though that Talion's story is far from over, obviously, as his death is essentially prevented by a mysterious wraith that after around 4 to 5 hours of playtime, we come to learn in a bit of a shock revelation is Celebrimbor, the ancient elf lord and master smith who's infamously known as the creator of the Rings of Power, and therefore a huge player in Sauron's initial rise to power. Together, Talion and Celebrimbor seek redemption and retribution for their own shortcomings, and this embarks them on a journey where they share a mutual goal to seek revenge on the Black Hand of Sauron, and in doing so, to try and cripple Sauron's armies entirely. Very early on, we're introduced to Gollum, who's drawn to Celebrimbor due to his connection with the ring, and because of this, Gollum helps the pair track down artifacts that reveal more about his backstory, showing plenty of cutscenes that reinforce Celebrimbor's link to the One Ring, and his failures in doing so by allowing Sauron to rise, something that Celebrimbor obviously deeply regrets. With their plan to systematically shut down Sauron's armies, this is where the Nemesis system begins to really intertwine with the main story. At first, it's a pretty fun little mechanic that adds another layer to the gameplay, but it quickly becomes a pivotal part of that main story, with Talion and Celebrimbor's goal being to influence the hierarchy, dominating or straight up murdering the captains and war chiefs in order to sow chaos within the ranks of Mordor's forces. While there are, of course, many threads and themes throughout the roughly 20-hour story, this is what takes up a fairly large chunk of the main path, wiping out Sauron's armies from within and putting plans in place so that when the time comes to take the fight back to Sauron and his lieutenants, many of these captains and war chiefs are actually under the influence of Celebrimbor's powerful wraith mind, causing them to fight against Mordor rather than for it. This leads us to some of the final confrontations in this game, those being essentially Sauron's 3 primary lieutenants: the Hammer of Sauron, the Tower of Sauron, and the Black Hand of Sauron, who is essentially the main villain within the game. The final confrontation with the Black Hand results in a pretty massive twist that I for sure did not see coming, as rather than the Black Hand trying to fight Talion, he actually takes his own life, absorbing Celebrimbor's wraith powers along with him, resulting in the Elf Lord's link to the One Ring, temporarily bringing Sauron back from the dead. Celebrimbor manages to hold off the Black Hand just long enough that Talion can intervene and eventually thwart the Dark Lord's plan, resulting in the death of the Black Hand without Sauron's full return. But the game then goes on to a pretty awesome, almost cliffhanger type moment. Talion is given a chance by Celebrimbor to finally rest at peace alongside his family, who were killed in the opening moments of the game, and although his temptation is strong, one thing is very clear to Talion: Sauron still remains a huge threat to Middle-earth, and that both he and Celebrimbor will never be able to fully rest knowing that they didn't try everything to stop the return of the Dark Lord, ending in Talion setting the perfect stage for the sequel, declaring that he and Celebrimbor must forge a new ring of power to take the fight back to Sauron. While this story is far from perfect and does have some glaring issues with the overall flow and pacing due to the inclusion of that Nemesis system, which can unfortunately often derail the more tense moments of the story by allowing us to kind of just go and slaughter boss after boss if we so please, I do think that the overall plot of this game is very strong and very enjoyable as a more casual Lord of the Rings fan, though I do see where a lot of people are coming from who don't agree with that sentiment. Celebrimbor's entire storyline throughout the game is essentially full of inconsistencies with other Tolkien writing, and hell, even in Season 2 of Rings of Power, which only just concluded in the last week or two, I won't go into spoilers, but that alone completely negates pretty much all of Celebrimbor's story within the plot of this game. Talion as a character on his own is also pretty inconsistent due to the fact that realistically a character this powerful who had this much to say about the war would have been mentioned in other canon material, and so again there are definitely some areas in which the story doesn't all add up with the rest of the entire lore, which only gets muddied even further in the sequel. Despite all that, I thoroughly enjoyed the connection between Talion and Celebrimbor, giving us an awesome experience between a half-man, half-wraith protagonist that resulted in what I consider to be a really solid storyline within the timeline of Middle-earth, and canon or not, I see it as a fantastic addition to the overall plot of the franchise. So to tie this video together, I think it is fair to say that I am very, very glad that I finally got around to beating this game, a game that I now see as an absolute classic from what is probably one of my top 3 favorite franchises in the world. If you love Lord of the Rings but aren't all that bothered about the intricate century-old lore that goes on in the background of the novels and the movies, as well as now the TV series, then I genuinely think this game is nearly a must-play, as it really does feel very authentic through that universe, at least at face value anyway. Honestly, just being in Mordor, fighting orcs and hearing the way that they chatter back and forth, the almost political infighting that we saw multiple times throughout the movies over things even as insignificant as which food they want to eat. All of that felt like it was portrayed so well in Shadow of Mordor, while also being maybe just a bit more outlandish and a bit more of that typical power fantasy type of setting that we're really used to in this universe. There's really not that many areas that I can point to as genuine critiques and issues with the game. Sure, it is far from perfect, but there's really no standouts when it comes to areas that it felt flat, especially not to the point where they had a significant impact on the game. While on the flip side, there are definitely multiple areas, namely that iconic Nemesis system, where this game truly does shine, and if it weren't for that pesky Warner Brothers patent, it could have been a genre-defining and almost genre-creating video game that may have sparked many more games to follow in its footsteps. For those of you still watching all the way through to the end, I want to say a massive thank you for all of the support. And if you guys are new here, please do consider hitting that subscribe button and turning on those notifications, as there is going to be plenty more content like this right here on the channel. Next up, we're covering God of War Ragnarok, a game that I consider to be one of the best we've ever seen, and only a week after that, at least if everything falls into place, I'm going to be covering the 15-year anniversary of a game that I mentioned a few times throughout this video, one of my all-time favorites in Assassin's Creed 2. So like I said, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on those ones. Thank you all so much for watching. You guys have a great day, and I'll catch you all in the next one.